All right, so today is going to be the second part of our reading of A Modest Proposal. Before we get into what we're going to read today, let's just go back and look at what we read yesterday. You should have these notes on your document in Google Docs, so just make sure that you have these. If not, you need to go back to yesterday's and look at that. All right, so we found some persuasive techniques. We were looking at ethos, pathos, and logos. The very beginning starts off with the melancholy object and seeing the word melancholy, which means sad, depressing. We know that we're going to be getting into some emotional appeal. So he uses that to talk about the problem of poverty in Ireland and needing a solution for that. And as we go down a little bit further, I didn't really highlight in this paragraph, but he does give us the logic of why we should consider his solution, because it's not going to be only about the poor, but it's going to take in these children, and it's going to be a much greater extent, and they're going to be able to support even more than just the poor people. All right, so we get some ethos here whenever he talks about how he's thought about it for many years. He seriously put some thought into this and why other plans have not worked. All right, so this highlighted part right here. We have some pathos whenever he says a child just dropped from its dam. And the pathos there is that the mother, that it's a mother, but typically an animal. And so that's going to be the emotion of pity or anger, and like saying you can't just demean them, you can't just lower them to the status of an animal. But then in the same point, he has logic. And his logic is that it doesn't take much to raise a child for a year. That's why we're going to let the children stay with their mothers for 1 year. You have some more pathos and ethos. One being that people would be upset about the abortions and murder, and then the ethos that he cares enough to come up with a solution. And this right here, this is a way, this is like, he kind of catches them where they can't say that they don't care, because then they would be admitting that they're savages and inhuman. All right, so on this part, we have a lot of logic there, and how he comes up to the number of 120,000 children of poor parents born each year. And then towards the end, we have the ethos in when he says a gentleman in the county of Cavan, because they are proficient there as thieves. So they're so knowing that the man is from Cavan, then he would be more knowledgeable about the age that thieves could be proficient. All right, so the irony with the quickest proficiency in that art, the irony is that he is saying art, but he really means stealing, which is the opposite of what we would consider art. And then art has a positive connotation. Stealing is considered something negative or wrong, so it's the opposite of what he really means. All right, and then towards the end here, I have ethos and logos. Ethos here, and I wanted you guys to kind of be able to explain it on your own, but the ethos here is the same concept as the gentleman in Cavan. The merchants, who are people who buy and sell, say that a boy or girl before 12 years old is no saleable commodity, and a commodity is something that's bought and sold. So a merchant would be someone who would be an expert in who or what age would be a saleable commodity and how much they could receive. So that brings credibility to the point that he's making. And then the logos, or the logic here, is he says that it would cost at least 4 times the amount to raise a child for 12 years than they would be able to profit from selling them as a commodity. All right, so that's what we read. So we read yesterday. So now let's get into this next part. And I'm gonna point out a few, and then there are a few things I'm gonna highlight, and I'm gonna want you to see if you can figure out the persuasive technique. All right, so this first part right here, let's highlight that. And this is ethos. He says, I shall now therefore humbly propose my own thoughts, which I hope will not be liable to the least objection. So whenever he's saying humbly, he's trying to say, you know, like, I'm going to try to be respectful about this. Like, this is, I'm trying not to be too pushy. So he's trying to be respectful, not pushy. So that is dealing with his character, what kind of person he is, and trying to make people say, okay, you know, like he's not wanting to be pushy with the point that he's making. Okay, now let's look at this next paragraph here. He says, I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ragout. So, there is his solution. So we get it. We finally see his solution. He's been leading up to it. We finally see it, and it's probably not what you expected. You get to it and you're like, what? And this is where that satire comes in that we've been talking about today. But before we get to explaining the satire of this, let's continue on with the persuasive techniques, because even though we're looking at it and we're like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe he just suggested that these children are going to be delicious and wholesome food. That's ridiculous. That's crazy. But he continues to move on with his plan as if it's just normal. So let's continue looking at and analyzing this for what he's doing. All right, so this next piece of ethos is going to take a little bit of context for this point. All right, so in the 1700s, which is in the 18th century when this was written, and when all of this was going on, the English looked at Americans as being barbaric. They were, you know, Americans were not considered to be high class. They were barbarians to the audience that Jonathan Swift is writing to. So, if they consider Americans barbarians, then isn't it more believable that someone like an American, a barbaric American, would know that a child is delicious, nourishing, and wholesome? Well, yes. So the ethos of the American saying that it's delicious, nourishing, and wholesome is just more believable than if he were to have just said, children at a year old are delicious, nourishing, and wholesome. And also, if he just said, children are delicious, nourishing, and wholesome, they're going to think he's crazy. But if he says, I've been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London, then that puts that American just far enough out of his acquaintance, but close enough that he can have the information. So, the American saying a child is delicious, nourishing, and wholesome. I'm just going to copy and paste it over here. It makes it more believable. All right, so whenever the American says it, it just makes it more believable. Now, I'm going to put this really big satire. We just went through a little lesson on satire, and remember some of the things that we talked about with what makes something satire, and how you can't necessarily look at one thing, but whenever you start putting a few things together, you can recognize that something is satire and that it's not genuine, it's not true, and it's not what they really believe. So if we look at our list of satire tips and things to look for to identify satire, Let's just look at a few. It may be one thing that it does, it's lacking respect or irreverent. All right, so that could be one thing. I would say that saying that we should eat American children, pretty disrespectful, irreverent, even though he is saying it as if he is being respectful. Like, what's odd is up until this point, he's been so respectful and he's been so trying to be so humble and modest, but then his solution is not. It is the opposite of that. It's politically incorrect. All right. Give me another thing that we talked about. Oh, wow. This is probably the best one. Over the top exaggeration. All right, so over the top exaggeration. Okay? Advocates something unethical and acts like it's normal. All right, so advocates something unethical and acts like it's normal. I think this is probably the best one so far. Okay. All right, and if you have knowledge about the poverty situation, if you have knowledge about the poverty situation, this might make a little bit more sense. And the reason I say that is because the rich people, especially the rich people in England who are over these Irish, if you understand a little bit about that poverty situation and the fact that the English and the rich treat these poor Irish people as if they're animals and that they're not true human beings, then you understand a little bit more about why he would suggest this particular solution. And it's this particular solution because his point is that he's wanting them to say, you can't eat people, you cannot do this, this is unethical. But then he wants them to realize that if they're people, and if it's unethical to do this, then they are people and it's unethical to treat them the way that you do. So let's move on. And we understand the satire there, but he continues on as if this is really his plan and people really thought he was crazy and that this was his plan, even though we can look now and say it's satire. Okay, so again he says he's going to humbly offer it to public consideration. So another piece of ethos. He's going to humbly offer it to public consideration. All right, and then this next part that he talks about, that of the ones that are already computed, 20,000 are going to be reserved for breed, whereof only 1/4 part to be males, which is more than we allow to sheep, black cattle, or swine. So this part that I have highlighted here. Now, the first thing is going to be logos. That's the first thing we see, because this is the logic of the portion to save for breed. And then he uses pathos. Whenever he compares, he lowers, I'm going to put it, he lowers the poor Irish to the level of sheep, black cattle, and swine. So just like he did earlier whenever he said a child just dropped from its dam, and he lowered those poor mothers to the status of an animal, a female, and a mother that's an animal, it's the same concept. Now he is lowering them to the level of sheep, black cattle, and swine. Okay, Now I'm just gonna highlight this in gray just because it's not necessary. It could be considered a persuasive technique, but it's not necessarily a point that I want to bring up as a persuasive technique, but it is a point that I want to bring up. So he says that the 100,000 that they're not going to save for breeding, that those 100,000 are going to be offered to sell to persons of quality and fortune. So here's the thing: is his solution is not going to be to take these poor children and have their families eat them. His solution is that you're going to take these poor babies and you're going to slaughter them just like you would sheep, like cattle, or swine, and sell them to rich people, the persons of quality and fortune, the rich people. And the children are going to suck plentifully in the last month so that they'll be plump and fat for a good table. Then he goes on and he says, a child will make 2 dishes at an entertainment for friends. And then how much if the family dines alone? All right, so, and then he just moves on and he continues with the satirical solution in adding details. All right, and so what we're gonna do is we're gonna read this part, and we're going to stop here for today after we read it, so you can kind of take in how he uses satire to prove his point.
I shall now, therefore, humbly propose my own thoughts, which I hope will not be liable to the least objection. I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is, at a year old, a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ragouste. I do therefore humbly offer it to the public consideration that of the 120,000 children already computed, 20,000 may be reserved for breed, whereof only 1/4 part to be males, which is more than we allow to sheep, black cattle, or swine, and my reason is that these children are seldom the fruits of marriage, a circumstance not much regarded by our savages. Therefore, 1 male will be sufficient to serve 4 females. That the remaining 100,000 may, at a year old, be offered in sale to the persons of quality and fortune through the kingdom, always advising the mother to let them suck plentifully in the last month, so as to render them plump and fat for a good table. A child will make 2 dishes at an entertainment for friends, and when the family dines alone, the fore or hind quarter will make a reasonable dish, and seasoned with a little pepper or salt, will be very good boiled on the 4th day, especially in winter. I have reckoned upon a medium that a child just born will weigh 12 pounds, and in a solar year, if tolerably nursed, increaseth to 28 pounds. I grant this food will be somewhat dear, and therefore very proper for landlords, who, as they have already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children.
So that's where we're going to stop for today. And Jonathan Swift goes on and he has a lot more to say about his plan and his reasoning. But one thing before we end, I do want to point out this part right here. And he says that it's very proper for the landlords to have the best title to the children because they've already devoured most of the parents. Now, what does he mean by that? He doesn't literally mean that they have devoured, like eaten the parents, but he's saying that because of these English landlords, these parents have been taken advantage of and they have basically been brought down to nothing and nearly killed, if not killed, because of the way the landlords have done them. And so that's the point that he's making, is he's putting the landlords in that very negative light as if they have killed these babies' parents. So that ends what we're going to read. You get how he uses ethos, pathos, and logos. You can see that he uses he uses a lot of irony by saying what the opposite of what he thinks should really happen. And he also uses satire to bring attention to this and giving that over the top, exaggerated solution and advocating for something unethical and acting like it is normal. Okay, so we'll have some assignments to do with this, and make sure you get all the notes. If you don't, you need to go back through and get them because you will appreciate having them later.